On the morning of November 20th, 2018, in the suburbs of New Jersey, two houses caught fire. Not a coincidence, not an accident. Two fires started separately within hours of each other. One at a residential mansion in Colts Neck, New Jersey. One at a house in Ocean Township, just a few miles away. Inside the Colts Neck mansion were 4 bodies. Outside the Ocean Township house were 2 terrified women screaming for help. Those 2 women were Paul Canero's wife and his 2 daughters. They had barely escaped. The woman who lived at the Colts Neck mansion never escaped. Neither did 3 of the people who lived with her. For over 7 years, those 2 fires burned in the collective memory of New Jersey law enforcement. For over 7 years, investigators asked the same question. Why would a man set fire to his own house with his family inside and then drive 4 miles to his brother's house and set that one on fire too? The answer, when it finally came in a New Jersey courtroom in 2026, explained everything. Paul Canero was the younger of 2 brothers. Keith Canero was the older. They owned a technology company together. They shared financial interests. They shared a family. But they did not share the same understanding of what money meant and what a man should do when money went missing. In November 2018, their company was in trouble. Funds had vanished. Keith Canero had discovered the theft. He had written an email the night before the fires, an email to his brother. The email said that he was cutting Paul off, that he could no longer access company funds, that the theft had to be explained and the losses had to be repaid. Paul read that email. He understood what it meant. It meant his lifestyle was about to end. It meant his access to his brother's wealth was about to disappear. It meant he had a choice to make. That night, he made that choice. The murders happened in November, but it took investigators years to build a case. It took time to trace the evidence. It took time to understand the behavioral patterns. It took time to realize that Paul Canero was not a grieving relative struggling with 2 inexplicable tragedies. He was a man who had orchestrated both fires with deliberate intent. The prosecution's case began with the fire at the Colts Neck mansion. Keith Canero had been found outside the house, on the front lawn, shot 5 times. One of those shots was a contact wound to his head. The gun had been pressed against his skull. Jennifer Canero, his wife, was found inside the house. She had been shot in the head and then stabbed. The 2 children, Jesse and Sophia, ages 11 and 8, were found in the upstairs bedroom. They had been stabbed multiple times. The medical examiner would later testify that the children were still alive when the fire started, that they had been left to burn in a room that Paul Canero had intentionally set ablaze. Think about that for a moment. An 11-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl, alive, surrounded by fire. They were stabbed first, weakened, unable to escape. Then the fire came. The prosecutor presented the forensic pathology report to the jury. The jury heard the words. The jury understood what this meant. This was not a crime of passion. This was not rage that got out of control. This was planning. This was premeditation. This was a man who had brought a gun, had shot his brother 5 times, including once pressed against his head, had then turned to his brother's wife and shot her and stabbed her. Then he had gone upstairs and stabbed 2 children. Then he had set the house on fire. Then he had driven 4 miles away and set his own house on fire with his own wife and daughters inside. The surveillance footage came next. A Porsche Macan with distinctive taillights was captured on video leaving Paul Canero's house in Ocean Township at approximately 5:30 in the morning on November 20th. The taillights were unique, not standard Porsche design, not common taillights that could be found on thousands of other vehicles. These taillights had a particular LED pattern that made them distinctive and identifiable. The prosecutor showed the jury the footage again and again. Here is the car leaving the Canero house in Ocean Township. Here is that same car on another street. Here is those unique taillights captured on multiple cameras across the township at different times. Here is the same vehicle leaving a location 4 miles away from the Colts Neck mansion, the mansion that would burn that same day. The timing was precise. The vehicle timing matched the murder timeline. The vehicle timing matched the fire timeline. The vehicle that left his house in the early morning was the same vehicle that would be identified by forensic analysts as having been present at his brother's house. But the prosecution's evidence did not rest on surveillance footage alone. They presented physical evidence, blood-stained clothing recovered from Paul Canero's home. The blood belonged to his brother and his brother's family. A 9mm projectile found at the crime scene that matched the bullets fired from a murder weapon. The scent of human remains detected in his wife's vehicle. Hair fibers consistent with the victims recovered in his clothing. The prosecution methodically walked the jury through each piece of evidence. They presented testimony from forensic experts. They presented testimony from family members who described the relationship between the brothers. They presented the email from Keith Canero, the email that said Paul was being cut off, the email that explained motive, the email that showed that Paul had less than 24 hours from receiving that message to committing mass murder. The jury began deliberations on a Friday afternoon. By Saturday, they had reached a verdict. 5 hours of deliberation. Not because the evidence was unclear, but because the evidence was overwhelming. The jury found Paul Canero guilty on all counts. 4 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated arson, 2 counts of weapons violations. The foreman read the verdicts one by one. Guilty, 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 guilty. Paul Canero sat in the courtroom and did not react. He had been convicted of murdering his brother. He had been convicted of murdering his brother's wife. He had been convicted of murdering his brother's 2 children. He had been convicted of setting 2 houses on fire as part of an elaborate cover-up, and he showed no emotion. No expression crossed his face, no indication that what was happening had any impact on him at all. The sentencing hearing came 4 months later. The courtroom was filled with family members. Jennifer's sister spoke about what she had lost: a brother-in-law, a nephew, a niece. She talked about an entire branch of the family that had been erased. She talked about celebrating birthdays without them. She talked about holidays that would never be the same. She talked about a man who had destroyed not just 4 lives, but the lives of everyone who loved those 4 people. The judge listened to every statement. When it was time for him to speak, he addressed Paul Canero directly. He called him manipulative. He called him cold-blooded. He said that Paul Canero had looked at a situation where he was about to lose money, and he had decided that murder was the answer. The judge said that the 8-year-old girl, Sophia, had fought for her life against a 200-pound grown man wielding a knife. That she had been stabbed while her brother was already dying or dead. That she had been left to burn. That Paul Canero had done that. The sentence was life without the possibility of parole. Paul Canero would spend the rest of his life in prison. He would never see another sunrise outside a cell. He would never taste freedom again. His wife, who had been inside the house when he set it on fire, had barely escaped with their daughters. His own children had almost died in the flames. Not because they were guilty of anything, not because they had done anything wrong, but because Paul Canero had decided that setting a fire to cover up his murder of his brother and his brother's family was the best plan. His appeals began immediately. His attorneys filed motions claiming that the judge had been unfairly biased, that the prosecution had presented misleading evidence, that the conviction should be overturned. The judge denied those motions. He wrote that it was not his role to protect Paul Canero from the consequences of his own actions, that Paul Canero had received a fair trial, that a jury of 12 people had looked at the evidence and decided that he was guilty, and that the sentence of life without parole was appropriate for a man who murdered 4 people, including 2 children, and then set his own house on fire to try to cover up his crimes. The internet obsessed over this case for years. People followed the investigation online. They downloaded discovery documents. They debated whether Paul was the real killer or whether there was someone else involved. They pointed to the third brother, Corey, and asked whether he might have been involved. They theorized alternative scenarios. They created timelines on forums. They watched the surveillance footage again and again, analyzing the taillights, debating whether the forensic evidence was sufficient. But when the evidence was presented in court, when the jury heard from the experts and the forensic analysts and the family members, the obsession ended. Paul Canero was guilty. He had murdered his brother and his brother's family. He had set fires to cover it up. He was going to prison for the rest of his life. There was no mystery left. There was only the cold reality of what a man had done when money and pride and greed collided with the lives of 4 innocent people. Inside his cell, Paul Canero has time to think about the morning of November 20th, 2018. He has time to think about the email his brother sent. He has time to think about the choice he made. He has time to think about the 2 children asleep in their beds when he decided to pour gasoline on their bedroom floor. He has time to think about the unique taillights of his Porsche Macan captured on every camera between his house and his brother's house. He has time to think about his wife and daughters, how they barely escaped the flames he set to cover up what he had done. He has time to think about the jury that looked at all of that and decided that he deserved to spend the rest of his life in a prison cell. And he will have a very long time to think about all of it, because Paul Canero is never getting out. He will spend every day of every year of every decade of the rest of his life in a cell, knowing that he murdered his brother's wife, and his brother's children, knowing that he set fire to his own family to cover up what he had done, knowing that 12 people looked at the evidence and said that he deserves to die in prison.